Welcome, everybody.
Welcome. Wow, this is amazing, seeing you all here. We've been looking forward for this day. Hi, I'm Darja. I'm Director General of Vinnova.
And I'm Helena Bjarnegård, and I'm the Chair of the Council of Sustainable Cities.
So let me begin by saying that innovation is about being competitive through solving real problems. And right now, we are at a crucial point in time where our ability to do so really matters. We are the last generation with a window of opportunity to make massive transformational change happen in every city, in every value chain, in every consumption pattern. We are also the first generation of leaders equipped with knowledge, technology, access to each other that could make such transformative change reality. But that means that what we don't have is time. And we all acknowledge the fact that, therefore, innovation at this point in time is not neutral. As Mariana Mazzucato would say, all innovation has both a rate and a direction. So, therefore, we must ask ourselves now, how do we create directionality? And how do we, in a real way, speaking of order of magnitude, accelerate our ability to co-create the innovative solutions that we need? So with those core insights, I would like to welcome you and say, welcome to this exciting day on the topic on how we mobilize for transformative change together.
And one of those very complex systems that affect us as human beings, that affects the climate, the air we breathe, the ecosystems, is the cities. And city development is one of the key areas where we need to find new ways to work together, to be able to meet the challenges of today and tomorrow. And after lunch, some of you will stay and try those new models, those new tests and tools of system innovation on cities. But first, we are going to listen to some international speakers, and we're very excited. And therefore, I'm going to present the moderator of today, Ann Lidgard.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Darja. Thank you, Helena. And once again, a warm welcome to you all. We have a very exciting program for you today, consisting of an open session in the morning now, and I can already tell you, as you've heard, we have some really thought-provoking speakers here. And then followed by lunch, and then after lunch at 1 o'clock sharp, the workshop starts for all of you that have pre-registered. But we are indeed extremely happy to have this lineup of speakers telling us about the real ways of giving us some clues to how to address these challenges. But also, as you will soon discover, we're equally happy to have such a broad representation from our government here today. Because I truly find that that is something which really symbolizes one of the real strengths that we have here in Sweden, our ability to cooperate. But before we get on with the program, I'm really curious just to find out who's here today. Because let's see now, can we have everybody from the business community just please just stand up a little bit? That are currently and that previously were part of the business community too. And if you're in a small and medium-sized business, like wave your hands a little bit like this. All right, good, good. Please sit down. And how about from government or public sector, currently active or previously been active? Okay, all right. Yes, the power of the public sector. How about academia? Do we have any from the universities here today? Yes, also. And any students, or are you busy studying? No students. Okay. And last but not least, how about the civil society, NGOs, non-profit organizations? Please stand up. And thank you for all the valuable work that you're doing. Excellent. So, did I miss anybody? Who hasn't been able to stand up in these? Please stand up now. Hey, I think I caught everyone. That's pretty amazing. So, this is true. I mean, you're such an amazing mix, and I really strongly encourage you to talk to one another, to talk to the next person sitting next to you, because that could be the next person that you want to partner with to build a better future. So don't miss this opportunity to network. So let's also see what happens in the word cloud. I don't know if you know, but you notice that we have this Menti code 461853. And let's just see what's going on here. Okay, so cooperation, yeah. Political action is important. Collaboration, love, yes, love, give us love also. System perspective, business models, all right. So we're going to check in a little bit later and see how this evolves throughout the day. Okay, but for now, let's move on with our program. And please join me now in a very warm welcome to the State Secretary to the Minister for Financial Markets and Housing, Elin Olsson, and the State Secretary to the Minister for Business, Industry and Innovation, Mrs. Stina Billinger. Please, a warm welcome. So we're extremely happy that you're honoring us today with your presence. And it's especially interesting because you represent two different ministries. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to ask you each, so why is this important for your ministry, Stina, if you begin?
Yeah, thank you. It's fantastic to be here. I think maybe we are here because of the same reason, because our government is guided by a vision to be the first fossil-free welfare state. And that affects all the political initiatives that we take and all the work that we're doing. So basically, that's our moon landing. That's our guiding star. Yeah. And therefore, I have to think, okay, so how does that affect innovation policy? In what way can we use innovation policy to be even closer to that vision of the fossil-free welfare state? So what I'm hoping for today is really that everybody puts on the fossil-free welfare state glasses and that you all innovate in order to help us to reach that vision, because then life is going to be better for all of us.
Great, wonderful. And how about you, Elin? Why is this such a high, interesting for your ministry in particular?
Well, basically the same reasons, but particularly in the portfolio for the Ministry for Housing is also the aspect of city planning, of course. And the SDG 11 with sustainable cities and communities is crucial, also considering with the mega trend of urbanization that we can see mostly international, but also affecting the Swedish cities and communities. And using this force as a transformative force with getting to this target or goal that we have set up for the Swedish society is crucial. This is where most investments will be made, and this is where innovation also can be used to really make big leaps. If we don't use this kind of force just continuing business as usual, we will really lose a great opportunity to move forward in the direction that is so crucial for both Sweden but also international, to set a mark and show that this is possible.
Great, thank you. And you already mentioned, the long-term target of becoming a focil-free welfare state.
It's not that long term anymore, though. We don't have that much time. So really, I'm focusing a lot right now because we also have the SDGs, and we know that we have to reach them until 2030. And a few years ago, we could have like 2030. Okay, let's discuss how to get there. Now it's the decade of delivery, huh? So I'm sort of it's not just this that makes me feel like something has to happen soon, but we have to energize the political system in delivering now and turning words to action. And therefore, we need the business community, and we need to transform the innovation and the science and the academic system.
Excellent,
well.
Yeah, excellent. And for today, what are your expectations for the event today, Elin?
Well, I'm most curious to learn more about this mission method and see how that can well, influence and make us sharpen up our tools and work more together, both especially considering the workshop that will be held in the afternoon about city planning, and how to scale up this very crucial working together also with the municipalities as a platform for this transformation. So I'm most looking forward hearing more about the method.
Good. Well, thank you very much.
Thank
you. Please have a seat, Elin.
Yes.
Stina, I'm going to... let's give her a hand. So, Stina, I'm going to keep you here for a little while because we have a very exciting announcement. And for that, I would also like to invite Darja up on stage. Please, want to...
Here?
So, what's going on, Stina?
Well, what's going on is that Sweden, we have very high ambitions in the innovation field. And we might have the best innovation agency in the world, don't you think? Yeah. Yes, we have. But still, I mean, we need to be influenced by the world out there. And we need to be challenged by other perspectives. And therefore, I'm extremely excited that Darja has this announcement.
And that's over my
So,
cue.
there we go.
Well, I'm
Over
not
to
going to bring
Darja.
it further. So, in order to make this transformative change happen, we need action. That was there, but we need informed action, and therefore our action needs to be informed by close collaborations with the actual experts and leaders in the world. In making this transformative change happen. So we need to co-create together with them. So therefore, I'm extremely honored and super proud to have the opportunity to now say that we have an expert panel of an advisory board with just such leaders with us here today that have accepted the opportunity to help us. And they have done so for various reasons, and they will let us know more. But let me just say that...
Who are they?
Who are they? And then this is where it comes. And I just want to introduce them properly. First of all, Mariana Mazzucato, please join us. Professor in Economics of Innovation and Public Value at UCL, but also the founder and director of Institute for Innovation of Public Purpose, and also sitting on the UN Committee for Development Policy, the Sustainable Development Policy. You work extensively with the EC Commission, and basically you are the person who is responsible for the European Commission now saying we need mission-oriented innovation. So very happy to have you here.
So happy. And my role will be to make us uncomfortable. If we're too comfortable about this, it's not working.
And then it's also my deep honor to also welcome Professor Banny Banerjee.
Oops.
From Stanford. And Professor Banerjee has pioneered the work of design thinking, but now also leading the work in systems leadership and models for large-scale transformation through leading Stanford Change Labs. And there are so many things to say about you too, but you're also a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Systems and Platforms.
Thank you very much. A singular pleasure to be here. I do think that Vinnova is probably one of the best suited to provide the kind of thought leadership that is sorely needed right now.
And then we have also chosen a person to really be complementary with a perfect inside-outside perspective on the Swedish system, Mr. Bertil Andersson. Welcome. Also with extensive experience, because you've served as Chief Executive of the European Science Foundation, a trustee for the Nobel Foundation, but you were also the third president of NTU Singapore, and you led that university to a global direction where it rose as now the leading top Asian university in normalized citation impact. So you have done quite a few things in your time.
Happy to be back here and also working with Vinnova. And indeed, my role, I feel, is to provide an inside-outside perspective. So we're looking back to work with you.
So, can I just give them 1 minute from the Minister of Innovation? From the government perspective, we need you to be hard on us. That's sort of what you started with. We need you to be concrete, and we need you to help us take the vision and make it concrete, down to policy. So there will be nothing that you can say that is sort of too open for us, or too hard, or too non-polite. So let's sort of put all that stuff on the side, and let's work together to fulfill the government's vision of the fossil-free welfare state.
We are taking that to heart.
Good, good.
So we are no longer an advisory board, we are a provocation board.
You can be both, I think. Sorry.
And to start that off, because now we have a program where you will all speak to us. One thing that really resonated with me from our conversation last night was that you were very clear, all of you, on the reason why you chose to accept our invitation. And that had to do with some of the things regarding on how important it is, what kind of leadership we show in Sweden, not to manage our own challenges, but to show leadership in the world. And I'm really looking forward for you to tell us more about that as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So now let's move on to our keynote speakers. It is truly an honor and a pleasure to please welcome back to the floor someone with true profound understanding of the complexity of systems challenges, working in over all continents all over the world, except Antarctica, I understand. Not yet. With people to try to find solutions to very complex problems. So again, please join me in welcoming one of the members of the International Advisory Board, Professor Banny Banerjee from Stanford Change Labs.
This clicker is supposed to work. Let's test it out. Okay. Thank you very much, Anne. Actually, Anne is, if things go badly, you can blame Anne, because she's the one who essentially pulled us here from, 3 years ago? I would like to speak to you a little bit about the approaches that we've been discovering and building. And the question we've been asking is that the class of challenges that we are facing is unprecedented, requiring a level of innovation that is unprecedented. So how should we think about this class of challenge, but how do we also do it in a way such that we can act in the time that is required? So I think if we take a step back, one of the things that's already come out in the introductory talks is the reflection that we are at a very, very critical moment in the history of our civilization. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the continued functioning of industrial civilization as we know it hinges upon what we do or do not do. And in that action, I wish one could be confident that the nations of the world are well prepared and are well motivated to really deliver on an alternate future, but we all know that that is not the case. And that means that the onus falls very heavily on the shoulders of those countries that are particularly motivated and have the mindsets to actually pull it off. And so we are looking to Sweden to pull off that level of thought leadership. But this is a graph from here, from Rockström's work, from the Stockholm Resilience Center. And I think it's a really alarming graph, because it shows the number of ways in which our planetary limits are being crossed, but also the ones that we do not know to what extent that we've crossed it or not. And we understand that once you reach a tipping point, the system wants to break itself rather than restore itself. And so we are so far away from delivering on what we call multi-generational well-being. As a system, we have served short-term needs at the cost of long-term stability, and we need to hurriedly find ways to restore ourselves. And so if we take a systems view, and if we say that any system is perfectly designed to give you the outcomes that it does, in the words of Dr. Batalden, then we are headed towards a system that is increasingly stochastic, with more and more very, very important feedback loops that are being broken. And the question is, can we actually bring it back into a different state where the outcomes are the natural outcomes of a system that's behaving? But that is where scaled and system level innovation needs to happen. And this is an entirely new class of challenges, right? It's a new class of challenge, and you might like the simultaneity of the scale, the urgency, the insidious nature in which we are culpable in making it, etc., makes it a new class of challenge. But what does that imply? It implies that the incremental way in which we work within the systems that arguably have contributed to making the problem is just not an option, not if we care, right? And we think in open loops where we think that as long as we are doing good, it's enough, but it's not enough. And so that's one of the core ethics that we need to find out. How can we think in terms of really what we are doing, whether it's going to close the gap or not? And one of the things we need to reflect about is how we think and what our institutions like to do. And there's a clear bias towards grabbing onto simplistic solutions, even if they don't have the theoretical basis or the theoretical power to actually deal with the complexity. And our knee-jerk reaction is that it's too complex, we cannot understand, we want to deliver on time, and so we let go of the critical thinking that is actually needed. But we have the intellectual power to pull this off. And what if we are looking at a certain future that is, that is brittle and increasingly brittle and fracturing, and it's predicated by the current models, it is actually an implication that if you want integrated futures that are much more stable, then we have to also alter not just our thinking, but very, very rapidly the structures by which we work. And that is a big transformation gap that we need to adopt as well. It's not just a matter of new technologies or new processes. It's an entire shift, but we have to do it simultaneously with the kind of action we need to take. So what we are claiming now is that if we recognize that these challenges are deeply systemic with complex forces conniving to give you the outcomes, then we must need, it stands to reason that our solutions must also be systemic in nature. And if they are scaled, they need to be scaled in nature. And if they are urgent and nonlinear, then our solutions must be delivered in those kind of timeframes. But one of our maladies is that we look through into a complex world through the narrow slits of our disciplinary or agency lens. And that traps us into interpreting it through those lenses. And that is one of the ways in which we fail, because the system has absolutely no respect for our disciplinary or agency boundaries. Right? It has none whatsoever. It is we who give that lens. So transportation and environment and energy, if they're not working closely together, it is our limitation, right? And so this is where the action is, and this is also the predicated direction in which we need to find some new capacities very, very quickly, because time is the one thing we don't have, right? So we talk about collaboration, but there's a very, very fundamental difference between collaboration and co-creation. Collaboration is where our identities, our agency identities, our disciplinary identities limit ourselves into how we should think. And this is quite different from co-creation, which is the identity is not ours. It is the nature of the challenge in parts that are understood and parts that are not. And how do we surround it with ways that are post-disciplinary? And where we look at our own agencies through a new lens, and we say, what do we have that, whether or not they conform to our legacy boundaries, can be leveraged in disproportionate ways, perhaps in completely new ways. And some of the ways that are completely new is the way we work together, and the degree to which we can actually create a completely new class of solutions and new class of solutions that are in some way commensurate with the class of the challenge. So there's no escaping this. Whether it's comfortable or not is not even germane if we care about the future, right? And I would imagine that a fair number of people in this room have children and relatives who are young, and you care about the future, right? And I think the reason why fundamental reason why we are doing this is because each of our perceptual lenses carry the limitation of what we choose to look at. And we actually need the parallax of different points of view to even understand what the system really is, or to identify where to intervene with it, so that the interventions make very, very leveraged use of very scarce resources and have the power to transform the behavior of the system. And that dialogue typically currently results in mutual disrespect, that they don't get our point. But it actually needs to create the way in which we can create the parallax, so that we can understand the system from different points of view, both from an understanding of why the system behaves the way it does, but also the opportunity space, right? So what I think I'm saying is that what you put in the center is not our organization or our agency's action repertoire or skill, but the system behavior and a larger vision of how the system ought to behave in the future, and everything is in service to that, right? And so what the understanding of the system is extremely crucial, because without that, we do not even have the table stakes to know where to intervene and why that is the best way to intervene, because coming up with ideas is not particularly hard, but having it be defensible in a rapid period of time, that it has the power to create system level impact, is, I think, the trick. And so we also need to have propositions that are genuinely transformative enough and are executed as such. So systems innovation is a new form of innovation, which is operating at the system level and all the way down. And it is essentially is about delivering disproportionate value to create, like, to outperform the normative by a very large margin, and to send the system in a new direction. And so a little bit about systems acupuncture. It's a methodology that we've been growing very collaboratively, but it does involve a combination of things where you use leadership as a very, very large lever in order to change how we operate, whether or not our institutions allow us to. Not holding our breaths for the entire institutions to change. This notion of a very aggressive innovation mindedness for what we can change by when and how, but also, unless it translates to tangible action, it's a thought experiment. We need to act. And these can't be sequential, they happen in simultaneity. And so what we're looking at is altered behaviors of systems, new relationships between the entities, and new ways in which the current the system actors are behaving, completely new paradigms that question our current paradigms and replace them with next generation economic models, next generation transportation models, etc. And the platforms that have the nonlinear capacity to stitch these together in order to get outcomes, in order to get self-restoring systems, in order to create the new capacities that are needed, that our current capacities are not sufficient for, and ultimately new system trajectories that are much more desirable than the ones that we have. So when do you use this? It is, you don't use it all the time. It is when, and you have a large number of processes, and we have a large repertoire and a portfolio that we're managing. And so if the challenge happens to be complex rather than complicated, where it's a dance being played by many system actors with emergent properties, but also the scale and the risk is high, or the salience of the importance is high, then these methodologies come very handy. But it looks, when you bring it down to practice, it's actually not rocket science. It looks like this, and in very short, elegant, ways of convening and working and so on, one can identify very powerful points of leverage. But this discussion between people who are not used to speaking to each other lights up opportunity spaces that you actually have to try this out to believe how powerful they can be, right? And so this is, in Africa and the UN looking at issues of, nutrition and youth. In the previous case, it was the collision between the demand for food and the degree to which there's massive deforestation in Latin America. This is the futures of the ocean, and some of the top experts from the ocean looking at it from different ways in order to figure out what is happening and what are feedback loops that can be changed. But this is also can be taught. It's something that we routinely teach. This is a picture from the class that Aneta, who's in the crowd, and me, we teach this in, and these are students who go from an engineering mindset or a policy mindset or some mindset, they've come with that, and they learn how to dive into the deep end of the pool and take on a large challenge, such as the future of the water in Islamabad or something like that, like big projects. And so if we are doing this, and if we are to do this, there are some implications, which is that, we need to think in terms of of where to intervene so as to have the most systemic effect and the most leveraged use of scarce resources and time. We do need to reframe success. We do need to reframe what constitutes success, because right there in the shape of our intentionality lies a lot of deep paradoxes, and then we try to kind of use that as a religion and fix the problem, when most of the problem is in how we framed success. I mentioned this, but we absolutely have to discover ways to work integratively, whether it's comfortable or not. We no longer have that option. But we also need to think in terms of intervention portfolios and how we have the portfolios be multi-temporal, so that we are looking at different time scales and how they are synergistic, and how each thing is setting up the right conditions and a broader ecosystem is being created. And I believe that given that we cannot hold our breath for our larger institutions to change in the time frame that we need them to, I think that, but meanwhile we also need to not spend too much time with high transaction costs in preparing ourselves to do it. There is a case for creating very limber and very agile platforms that pull people from different places, but able to organize in a way that we can have action. So essentially what we are saying is that we must work in a way that moves the needle. And that means that any intervention that we have to ask ourselves, does it have the potency to actually make a difference? Or is it just simply better than what we've done before, right? Is this a bigger aircraft, or is it a spaceship that can escape the gravitational constant, right? Or the escape velocity? Can it do that? Does it have scale-mindedness and a theory of scale? So a theory of success or a theory of transformative change has many components, and a theory of scale is one of them. And can it be deployed in not just fast, but in a nonlinear way? Because if we are chasing a nonlinear problem, it had better be nonlinear, right? And is it integrative, or are we having very tiny, narrow silos and looking at problems in isolated and fractured ways? Because that is one of the ways in which we've gone wrong. So I'm going to pause there and perhaps hand it over to you, Anne.
Thank you, Banny.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's move into. So, I mean, you've been working with this with many different groups, and isn't there a risk that this can be conceived just as another process, and it turns into more like an academic exercise than really having impact? Could you comment on that?
Of course, it could be. It could become. We have a great skill of turning everything into an academic process, because if you look at academia, the academic institution has come up with all the knowledge that we rely on. But on the other hand, it is also based on a theory that if you throw something good over the fence, there's a long line of policymakers or activists who are waiting to catch that. And we've known about planetary limits for how long now? 40, 50 years, and the limits to growth. So I do think that we have to be very, very concerned about that failure mode, and essentially work in a way that is managed, and that we essentially, at the same time as that we carry the humility of knowing that these are unprecedented class of challenge, and these tools are also are growing in rapidly, but we have to be very, very action oriented, and part of it is creating the measurement and the navigation systems so that we can correct ourselves as we go.
So it's very much also about designing, also not the sort of the process leading to the theory or checking the theory of success along the way. I understand, but and you often talk about the need to organize ourselves in new ways and multi-level organization. Yeah. Would you care to comment a little bit on that as well?
Yeah, I think that if you think about the fact that we are working at many levels, where at some level the biggest constructs of our world, the institutional constructs, and I mean institutions in the larger frame of the world, where we have broader frameworks such as the nation state or the welfare state. These are institutions, And then there are institutes and mechanisms to carry it all the way down to the consequent detail of what should the neighborhood look like, right? Or how should these players, the NGOs, operate at something? And so there's a scale regime that we are crossing, but we're also crossing regimes in terms of the way we make influence. We make direct influence. We have influence in different ways in which where our models that we come up with can actually infect different players in ways that we don't have a direct influence on, but is very meaningful. But ultimately, we are also catalyzing a new world, and we are actually envisioning and delivering on a new future, and that is crossing both in terms of the nature of the influence and the regimes, and that speaks to the way we organize ourselves. We need to organize ourselves so that none of the big blocks are left unaddressed.
Yeah. And now, I mean, you've been able to understand a little bit about now the strategic innovation partnerships that have been launched by our government, and you said that you were here to also provoke, right? A provoking board. You have two representatives here from government. Would you like to just say a few words directly to them now?
I think that the fossil-free welfare state is an enormously beautiful concept, right? And it's that concept is not just a concept, but it has conceptual notoriety. It makes other people sit up and think, why can't we model something bigger in terms of that, right? But I actually want to talk about a certain tension that Sweden needs to deal with, which is that on one hand, you're one of the most successful countries in the world by so many different measures, in hard measures and in other measures because of your culture and because of the welfare state model, etc. And you have created a very ambitious mission. But you're a very small country, and the climate, the degree to which it's going to affect you is not just influenced by the degree to which you can directly influence by the consumption that you have in Sweden, which means that you absolutely must think of the globe as your scale. You absolutely must. And I think from an innovation theory standpoint, there is every reason to think of it as that, because it forces a certain scale-mindedness to say that, okay, while we are doing this for ourselves, which part of it can we extract and create a model and a competency for that we create markets, global markets around. So that is I'm pushing, I know, but I think that the one, I would say, criticism I have of the Nordics and not just Sweden is that the degree of talent and sense of purpose you have is still seen in terms of Sweden or in terms of your own areas. And at some level, I want to shake you and think, do you have any idea what the scale of the problem is and how hungry people are for those solutions and you to lead them? And so that, like, to have a global perspective is very important now.
Great. Thank you very much, Banny. Thank you. Let's give him another.
Thank you.
And now, moving right along, our next speaker has become, I would say, almost synonymous with the word missions. As she truly is a thought leader when it comes to the role of government and missions-oriented work. As you already know, currently active at the University College of London, please join me in a warm welcome, another member of our advisory board, Professor Mariana Mazzucato.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here because so much of my work has been trying to rethink the state in the 21st century. And you can't do that at an abstract level. You have to do it by actually observing what different types of state institutions are doing, the problems they're facing, and the fact that we're on the board of Vinnova, such an ambitious public organization, means we can also do a lot of learning by doing, trial and error, and not fearing making mistakes, but actually learning from them and thinking about the dynamic capabilities and capacities that even the public sector needs in order to actively co-create value. So that's really where I want to focus on, this notion of co-creation of value. We hear the word co-creation a lot, but of value, of economic value, bringing so many of the ambitions and the missions and the vision to the center of how we think about the economy. So it's less of a peripheral, sorry, I have a little timer here, I haven't put it on so I can talk for hours, less about the periphery, doing like the the hardcore economics here and then the fun little kind of social and environmental projects there. And to do that, I want to take advantage that I've just come back from the dark side, so Davos, where there was so much talk about rethinking capitalism. And that's largely, well, there's different reasons for that, but there was a very provocative letter written in the New York Times in September by 200 CEOs of some of the biggest companies worldwide, and it was all about rediscovering purpose. And it was basically a mea culpa letter saying, shit, we've kind of screwed up, right? We've just been maximizing shareholder value. That's led to all sorts of problems in terms of short-termism, and especially in terms of the lack of reinvestment, they say, rightly, it's a good thing that's being said, into our communities, into the workforce, and very much into the long run. Right? So much short-run thinking. And the conversation very quickly resuscitated this word called stakeholder capitalism, not maximization of shareholder capitalism. And what's so interesting is that it received all this buzz, and again, almost every Davos section either talked about purpose or stakeholder capitalism. And you are a country in a region that has been experimenting with this notion for a very long time, which doesn't mean we should be romanticizing, the Swedish or the Scandinavian model, but coming back to this issue of learning by doing and trial and error. There's so much, I think, that we, as a global capitalist system, let's just assume that's the system for now, that we're not going to go backwards into feudalism, and it's not necessarily about going into some other mode of production, but really redoing capitalism differently. There's so many lessons that we can be having in terms of conversing with you on this issue of how to do capitalism differently at the same time that we're tackling these fundamental issues around climate and in a specific way around these 17 SDGs. So it's kind of killing two birds with one stone, both solving the biggest problem of our time, climate, but also really rethinking the welfare state and rethinking the business model at the core, which has gotten us quite into some trouble. So first of all, it's a great time, oh sorry, I should also say what I'll talk about, which is this notion of, oh well, they don't go backwards, just forwards, it's okay. They go backwards. Using this concept of missions in terms of actually trying to solve really important goals, but the how, the process that you both talked about. How do we do that in terms of rethinking the value chain, but also the values? So my chair at UCL, I forced them to put in the word public value, but the word doesn't exist in economics. We have things like social value or the public good, but the public good is always like this correction for what the private sector is not doing. So I'm going to talk about this word quite a bit as I go on, and I will, oh well, it just went by itself. I will use that excuse. Am I moving these or is someone back there moving it? I don't know. Let me be, okay. This notion of missions and the reports that I recently wrote in the European Commission to both do the concrete stuff, what does this actually mean for policy, how we transform innovation policy and industrial policy, but also at the same time really rethink the design of the system itself. And what this slide is about is really saying, guess what? This is a great time to be having this conversation about rethinking the direction of capitalism, because so much about the SDG discussion is not about the rate of growth, but the direction in order to solve these goals. There's also this wonderful concept worldwide, very much also in the US, about the Green New Deal. And the green bit, we should really know what that means from, as Greta says, the science is out there, but the deal? What's the deal? What's a new form of contract, of relationship, of symbiotic, mutualistic, dynamic, exciting public-private partnership as real co-creators in this space? We know so much less about that. And also, I should say, even before the missions concept kind of was brought in, partly due to my fault, but anyway, also for all sorts of other reasons in the Commission. Already the Commission has been talking about these challenges for a long time. These words plastered all over Brussels: smart, inclusive, sustainable growth. We can laugh at that and say, oh yeah, blah, blah. It's quite radical if you start unpicking them. I flew in last night from a country, the UK, which has been growing over the last decade, not in that direction. Even just the word investment-led growth, which was central to the Juncker plan, is actually quite radical. The UK has been growing through consumption-led growth, not investment-led growth. And that consumption, because wages haven't been rising for the last 20 or so years, has been fueled by private debt. So the ratio, sorry for all this kind of boring numbers, but they're really important. The ratio of private debt to disposable income in the UK is back at record levels. It's back to the level it was just before the financial crisis. And guess what caused the financial crisis? That. So you'd think this would be plastered all over the papers, especially the FT. Silence. And by the way, you can see these figures, consumption-led growth and private debt to disposable income, in the classic measures that we use around GDP. So as much as I'm a big fan of rethinking GDP, how we measure growth, and wonderful discussions around the world, especially parts of the world led by women, so Finland, Iceland, Scotland, and I'm forgetting one of the countries, about wellness and well-being, New Zealand, we can, even with the classic measure of GDP, start scaring ourselves into action, but we don't use it for that. We just worry about the 0.4, 0.5% increase. We don't look at the inside, what it's telling us about the trends and how we're growing. Anyway, so all this just to say, hey, fantastic. There's a conversation out there. Let's use this conversation to be a thorn in the side of how we're currently doing capitalism. And so much of my work has been about unpicking one bit of that, not just kind of taking down the whole mantelpiece. And that's that we have to not only redesign business through this notion of purpose and stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism, we also have to redesign internally the state, because we have for too long accepted this notion from standard economic theory. And by the way, one area I would sort of differ with you, Banny, is that in order to be really multidisciplinary, we need to understand the disciplines and the internal bottlenecks. Otherwise we say, yes, let's mix economics with all these other things, and then we don't realize within economics there's been a 100-year-old debate about certain things, which you'll only realize if you surface up some of that disciplinary kind of fights. So I completely support everything you say, at the same time that we uncover the assumptions within the disciplines. And to do that, you actually have to have some disciplinary knowledge to move cross-disciplinary. So the disciplinary bottleneck in economics is that we have assumed that the public sector should only intervene, and I'm literally thinking public, whether it's Vinnova, BBC, the KfW, a public bank, DARPA, in the US, if there's a market failure to be fixed. So this notion that you're running around just putting bandages in the system, actually having to wait for things to screw up to then come in and have a justification to enter, is just the wrong starting point. And it's also really problematic narrative. You're a fixer. At best, you're an enabler. Oh, even better, a de-risker. How cool is that? It's so uncool. I mean, if you are a smart young graduate of any university in the world and you have the option to be a risk taker, a creative value creator, or a fixer, enabler, de-risker of the Elon Musks, where will you go? Right? So this affects the choices people make and where they want to work. To be a civil servant, or to work in Google, or God forbid, Goldman Sachs, or even worse, McKinsey. Right? Anyone here from McKinsey or any of those guys? Okay, good. Very good. Yes, no hands went up. Just kidding. I'm sure they're fine. Actually, the reason the public sector increasingly relies on the McKinseys, it's not their fault, is this idea that you're just there to de-risk makes you fear failure. So you'd rather outsource it, some of the stuff that's being done, to a consulting company, the PwCs, the Deloittes, that currently, by the way, are running Brexit at very high fees. No one knows the numbers, but very high fees, precisely because the state has stopped investing in-house in its own capacity, but also the willingness to take risks. Anyway, so it's not that these failures don't exist, they do. The public good problem is around positive externalities. When there's things that are produced like new knowledge or clean air that have such high benefits to everyone, then by definition there will be underinvestment in it in the private sector, because it's hard to appropriate the returns just for yourself. So the state comes in, fixes that, hopefully, by funding, say, basic research. That's, by the way, why I sound American. I'm not, I promise, born in Italy, Italian parents, but when I was young, we moved to Princeton so my dad could be funded by the US government, because he does nuclear fusion, in a tokamak, an accelerator in Princeton University funded by the DOE, the Department of Energy. There's no controversy around that. We all know the state should be funding basic research. Some do it more, some do it less. But the fact that it should fix that public good problem is kind of common knowledge, very standard framework. The opposite would be a negative externality, something bad that happens, and the companies are not accounting for it in their costs, something like pollution, so the state has to come in and correct it so the cost is absorbed through something like a carbon tax. Or information and asymmetric information, which people have won the Nobel Prize for models around that, means that cute little smart medium enterprises don't get enough financing. So we have SME policy, which I'm not a fan of. Most small and medium enterprises don't even want to innovate. Most of them are perfectly happy with the status quo. They're not very productive or efficient. Some even treat their workers quite badly. Who cares about them? The few, I'm doing this on purpose because I know you're, no, anyway. The few that do want to innovate and are ambitious and are not happy with the status quo need serious financing, need patient long-term finance. By the time the SME financing is spread so thin, it's too little once it arrives to those ambitious SMEs. Anyway, so, you know, there's all these different market failures. We have different types of, patches for them. But the problem is that just looking at economic history, which is not a bad thing to do sometimes because capitalism is quite recent. There's nothing universal about it. It's been around for about 250 years. It's fundamentally different from feudalism in terms of the level of dynamic kind of technological change. The biggest technological changes that we have experienced in our current capitalist mode have actually occurred from both public and private actors, but the public sector often taking a very high level of risk, of uncertainty in the early stage of the development, which then crowded in private sector investment. But really, it's very hard to see the role in any of these big shifts that we've had, what economists call general purpose technologies that affect production, distribution, and consumption, if you were to view it just in terms of fixing, putting patches here and there. So the lessons that we can learn if we want a green revolution, let alone the previous IT revolution, will be limited if we just think of it in terms of bandaging things up. And so the reason I got very interested in the notion of missions was that in actually looking at the history of technological change, you can actually observe particular types of organizations that were fundamental within the state, that went beyond the notion in Keynes of needing to be counter-cyclical. Keynes's big point was, hey guys, guess what? Look at the data. We more or less have recessions every 20 years, and when the state doesn't then come in and fix it counter-cyclically, that recession turns into a depression. So if you do look at the data, and the data's public, just watch what happened between 1800 and World War II. There was depressions, not just recessions, more or less every 15 years, 10 to 15 years. And what Keynesian economics did was to really tame that so that the state would come in when things were bad. Because if everyone cuts the demand, then you get this problem that he called the liquidity trap. But what this tells us is something much more. Even in the boom, what should the state do? Just step back. So much of the technology that powers all your smart products, I see some of you taking photos of me up here, you can do that because of the technology that's inside your smart and not stupid phone. The internet, GPS, touchscreen display, Siri, I could go on, were all financed with taxpayer money within public institutions like DARPA that were fundamentally actually taking risks. For every internet which DARPA financed, there was many failures. You just know about the successes. And whereas a VC, venture capitalist, will often brag about this, yeah, we're risk takers, you often don't know, or I should say the opposite, you only know about the failures that government makes because it's so well told in the public narrative, but these successes, we often don't realize that they too receive public money, but then we don't unpick, well, what happened in that organization? How were they able to take risks when actually, often when bureaucrats make mistakes, they're plastered on the front page of a newspaper and perhaps lose the job? But also, what was the hiring practice? How did they retain flexibility and adaptability? All characteristics we know are fundamental for innovation. And so really it was this kind of interest of mine to look at within the organizations, how did they work, that got me interested in this notion of missions that then I started to speak quite a bit about over actually the last decade to different people in the European Commission. And it was really Carlos Moedas who allowed me then to write a couple of reports too, one putting forward the notion of missions in terms of, you know, each one of these organizations was solving a problem. right? DARPA was trying to get the satellites to communicate. The internet was a solution. GPS was a solution to know how to precisely bomb particular countries. So these were all also wartime, Cold War scenarios. So the idea was kind of twofold. Let's really understand how policy can be more ambitious, problem-oriented, outcome-oriented, and then apply those lessons, not to wartime scenarios, but to the biggest social, wicked problems that we have today that are so much harder, actually, than many of those problems. But the other thing was also admitting that the role of these public institutions that I mentioned, and this is just an example in the US, were actually distributed across the whole innovation chain. Not just basic research, and not even just the link between basic and applied, but also patient, long-term financing of particular companies that, again, wanted to innovate, that needed patient long-term finance. And then even the procurement, the kind of demand-side policies, even further down. So the whole innovation chain was important to have this kind of ambition. And I should just pause here, because this is the bit I think that's less known. In-Q-Tel, by the way, is the CIA's public venture capital fund, but also the SBIR, which is a small business innovation research program in the US, works by setting a target of about 3% for each of the departments, health, energy, defense, for procurement, meaning government as purchaser, and those funds going to those small enterprises that, again, want to innovate. And what's interesting is that that basically acts like a public venture capital fund, but the time frames are so much longer. The VC model, venture capital model, is very exit-driven. They want to exit in about 3, maximum 5 years. And if you look at the history of biotechnology, it shows there's lots of problems there. You get lots of PLIPOs, sounds like a disease, productless IPOs because of that rush to exit. And so where venture capital has worked quite well is when it was kind of icing on the cake coming in later on the back of these more patient public funds, whether they also be Yozma in Israel, which was a big public venture capital fund. And that would be fine, as long as we talked about it that way, right? Instead of allowing the kind of risk-taking narrative to be monopolized by the VC sector, as important as they are. Really, what they were also able to do was to enter later, once much of the risks were, in fact, taken by a public entity. So immediately, one would start to ask, oh, all right, that's cool. How are we going to socialize then, not just the risks, but also the rewards, right? Who actually was taking some of the biggest risks is perhaps the 20% that the VCs get too much compared to what they actually did. Sometimes it's fine, maybe it's not, but that requires a more objective analysis of the production chain in terms of the division of innovative labor across the different value creators. And so what I tried to convince the European Commission to do was to say, okay, instead of having these handouts to particular sectors or particular types of companies like SMEs, why don't we really get serious about this challenge-led notion of what innovation can do and apply the lessons from the moon landing? And this year, as you know, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary to the SDGs or any way that they are interpreted at the city, regional, or national level. To get a man on the moon and back again in one generation, it required real vision and inspiration. Listen to the Kennedy speech. He basically says, you know what, it's going to cost a shitload of money. We're probably going to fail along the way, but it's worth it. And he starts talking about all the spillovers that are going to happen, all the intersections between different types of actors in the economy, from nutrition, materials, textiles, of course, aeronautics. And what then happened is that the tools that government had, like government procurement, grants, and loans, were used to fuel bottom-up experimentation to solve that problem of getting a man on the moon and back again in a generation. So unpicking that is what led to this first report, which then was greatly actually voted on by the European Council and Parliament. So this is now a legal instrument. And the idea is you begin with a challenge, turn it into a mission, really get cross-sectoral. This is the most important thing. It's not about one sector. So a cancer mission is not about health. It's about completely rethinking how we're living. And that immediately brings in lots of different sectors. And then using the tools that governments have to crowd in those different types of projects, of which, you know, many will fail, right? So that willingness, again, to experiment. But the way that public and private then work together is to solve the problem. It's no longer about, oh, we need to be business friendly, we need to show our commercialization potential, we need to prove economic value by the public sector, always worried, oh, how many startups will be created, how many patents, how much new jobs. It's about solving big public goals. And by public goals, I mean, because we hopefully live in democracies, goals that are also set together as the SDGs were. And really to get what I would call symbiotic, mutualistic partnerships to get there. To get to the moon, there was Honeywell, Motorola, General Electric. And of course they made profits. This wasn't CSR or even ESG. They wanted to make money, but to solve a problem. And the money they made, if you actually look at the contracts, this is something I've become obsessed with. I've found myself asking to have more lawyers in my living room. I used to want them to leave and get more interesting people. Now I'm thinking we need to relook at the law, the institutions, the rules of the game in the contracts. They were really working hand in hand. And of course, any of the big missions, whether they be the global ones like Plastic Free Ocean, or the more kind of city level ones, where actually a lot of the really interesting experiments are happening. I think in Sweden you're really leading on this, require really understanding this whole issue of intersectoral, interactor, interdisciplinary for academia, interconnections, of even reimagining what the missions themselves are. And so in fact, we came up with 5 very simple rules, but if you unpick each one of these, you realize how difficult it is. For example, this one here I've already mentioned, but cross-disciplinary also means let's bring new voices to the table for even framing what the missions are. And I'm thinking even just in academia. If you look at the Plastic Free Ocean mission recently, no one has done more work on that to stimulate the public imagination of what the possibilities are than David Attenborough from the cultural sector with that fantastic documentary called Blue Planet, where the last episode made so many school children upset by seeing these little baby dolphins choke on the plastic. So this is not just about the STEM subjects. We should rethink the humanities, the creative sectors, the poets, who can help us really also think of how to make those missions as inspirational so it's not just a Kennedy speech. And this whole issue of how you redesign tools, again, not just procurement, but if you have a public bank, which many countries do, like Germany, the KfW, Italy, we have the Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, it's basically a handout machine. Whoever yells the most gets the money. How do you transform a public bank to be a mission-oriented public bank, providing the patient, long-term finance to those organizations that are willing, so you pick the willing, you don't pick the winners, willing to engage with government at all the different levels for these big challenges that it has ahead. And of course, the EU has chosen these mission areas. They have the mission boards. And I really think the devil's going to be in the detail to make sure that this doesn't just become another trendy topic. Before we had smart specialization, and now we have the missions. And I think they're really good signs that it is being taken seriously, but it's going to be really key for governments at the member state level to rethink how they operate precisely in this kind of cross-departmental way, which also means that we would end up doing all sorts of things differently, including our budgeting. Outcomes-based budgeting, for example. The Jesuits had this wonderful thing that when they had money in the pot to do good, you needed 2 keys. One from the procuratore, the visionary, and the accountant, and one from the rettore, the visionary. So 2 keys going in, vision and accounting, to open up the money box. That's basically, I think, what missions are. So let me just move on. This is one of the less sexy bits, but this is about asking, what does this mean for how we evaluate public investments? Instead of saying, which market failure are you going to fix, what are you going to say? And also, once it's happened, how do you evaluate it outside of the siloed cost-benefit analysis, net present value calculation that would have killed the moonshot from the start? It would not have happened had those calculations been made. And again, if you look at Kennedy's speech, he actually says that. He says, we're not going to evaluate this by every little cost. It's going to be the dynamic spillovers across the economy that we're going to look at. And when I first started thinking about missions, I actually organized a conference with leaders of mission-oriented organizations back in 2013, and I asked them exactly that. How do you evaluate what you do? And I remember Cheryl Martin, who was the second leader of ARPA-E, like DARPA, but in the Department of Energy, said, we evaluate ourselves by how much risk we're willing to take and how much economy-wide impact our innovations have. And they are, by the way, one of the biggest innovators for battery storage. let me just move on to say that this is very much about thinking about the organization of the state. So public, not political, flexible, adaptable. This is really, really important, because if you don't do this, then you're not going to be strategic enough. You won't know even how to distribute those risks and rewards and think about that portfolio. But there's so many different lessons to learn, and that's why we, through my institute, are working very closely with Vinnova, who we believe is not just, in the title, such an innovative organization, but has been thinking through lots of these issues for quite a bit of time, along with Sitra in Finland, along with MindLab, which was an organization in Denmark. So Scandinavia has not just had a welfare state, but has been thinking about these issues, which doesn't mean it's perfect, but it's a very interesting place to be. What we've done recently is to say this has to affect how we do old things like industrial strategy, this word that's back. Even Europe is now talking about the Green New Deal as green industrial strategies. The danger in the past was that the strategy just became a list of sectors. Like in the UK, we had 5 magic sectors: creative industries, financial services, aeronautics, life sciences, and automobiles. To do what? Right? So it changes things. You worry about the big challenges, and the UK, through some of the work we did with them, came up with 4. And then we did a mission-oriented commission for the industrial strategy to transform each and every one of these challenges into concrete ways for all the different sectors. AI, by the way, being in all of the different missions, could work together in new ways. And Dan Hill, who's here, head of strategy for Vinnova, helped us very much around the mobility one, and this whole issue of, again, getting lots of different sectors and really fueling even innovation, or especially innovation in areas like disabilities and assisted technologies, in order for the future of mobility challenge to really be 100% accessible to everybody. That requires a particular type of innovation, private and public sector led, to fuel new solutions. And so, again, redesigning all these different areas. The work we did in Scotland was they didn't have a public bank like Germany. We helped them set one up. And again, always saying, be careful. There's so many things to do wrongly with public banking when it just becomes a subsidy, a guarantee. In Italy, we call it una pioggia dei sussidi. It rains subsidies, which just increases the parasitic kind of public-private relationship. In Germany, by the way, a very interesting thing that happened recently, when they had their Energiewende mission, it did transform how their public bank was interacting with the steel sector, an old sector. They made it conditional. They made their loans to the sector conditional on the sector reducing its material content. So it was conditions on transformation. So much of what's happening with steel or coal around the world is simply to help them survive, right? So a bailout. We just had a bailout in both the UK and in Italy for steel, no conditions attached. Fiat, by the way, when Marchione went to Detroit to buy Chrysler, which was in public hands because they were bailed out, along with the banks, Obama, in a rare moment of confidence, said to Marchione, here, you're going to invest in hybrid technology, because he saw how Fiat was operating in Italy was just very inertial and very kind of ambivalent in terms of how it interacted with the state subsidies it received. So every penny of subsidy, co-investment, and guarantee can become conditional as a carrot for that transformation of the sector to fuel a public goal. That really means redesigning those contracts that I mentioned. I've finished my time, so I'll just finish with this slide here to say, if we take seriously this notion that you have to really take risks and negotiate the value, what is being created and how, it's the way to get inclusive growth as well. You don't get inclusive growth, one of the big challenges I put up there in the beginning, just by redistributing through the taxation system. You can get it in a pre-distribution way by getting these contracts right. If we're going to have public institutions taking risks, co-designing, co-creating, making bets, both Tesla and Solyndra got the same amount of money in the US. But when that happened, Solyndra, when it went bust, was bailed out by the taxpayer. When Tesla did well, it's the genius, Elon Musk. So how do you really structure these portfolios, for example, in a way that you socialize both risks and rewards? There's all sorts of ways to do it. In some cases, when it's downstream, of course, you can take out equity. As Obama said to Tesla, we want 3 million shares in your company if you don't pay back the loan. Hattie said, we get 3 million shares if you do pay back the loan. The price per share went from 9 to 90. That multiplied by 3 million would have more than paid back the Solyndra loss and the next round. But that's for that downstream investment. Upstream, we should be really governing the patent system better. Patents today are too upstream, so the tools for research are being patented. They're too wide and they're too strong. that's impeding innovation. It's unproductive entrepreneurship. That's a lack of governance. That's a bad deal, right? So rethinking the patent structure, thinking of conditions on reinvestment, and also in some cases how to have either equity or a state fund. State of California is thinking about this because the public school system has completely been decimated in a state that's received massive amounts of public investment, how to kind of rethink that whole value creation process so we get these pots of public money that are rewards for that public sector risk-taking. Anyway, I will just finish by saying we are thrilled in the institute that I run that Vinnova is one of our partners in getting this learning by doing. Again, the devil in the detail. What does it feel like to step out of the box of fixing markets, to be a co-creator as a learning process conversation between public organizations, as ambitious as what the private sector does in business schools? Thank you.
I'm actually going to take a... Thank you very much, Mariana, for this. Please step into the center a little bit. So I actually have a few questions for you. I have one question that I just received from a person in the audience. So this is, now we're going on the Slack line, right? So economists are ruling the world, and the main problems we face are in the realm of biology, physics, climate, etc., right? How the beep, okay, I want to say everything here. Do we engage economists and their linear models in our pursuit of a non-linear problem where science is at the core, not economics?
I think that's the wrong way to think of it. That almost gives, in fact, I'll just put up the last slide by Plato, which is about narratives. That gives economists too much power. So as I was saying before to Banny, there's so much debate within economics. The problem is not economics. It's that one side of the economy won. So if you read Adam Smith, it was full of philosophy and the moral sentiments. The real question is how economics has become very linear, very constrained, also very arrogant, to prove how scientific they were. They brought in Newtonian physics. So the problem is not that there's too much math, there's the wrong math. I often tell that to students who are trying to rethink the curriculum. The risk is they're just going to make it user-friendly, right? Take out the math, and all the underlying assumptions are still going to be there. And the underlying assumptions are very much about unique equilibria, that the averages matter, the representative firm, when actually what innovation does is it causes constant differences between firms, and particular designs of the selection mechanisms allow some of them to survive, some to grow more. So you could even, within economics, make it so much more exciting, which I think we should do, because the danger is we just say, oh, economists are terrible, too, kind of closed-minded, take that out and give it to the scientists, without realizing that the real issue is the lack of debate within economics in order for it to be a productive member of the conversation with these other disciplines. But the problem is also that the tools inside governments are being fed by this economic thinking. So that's too much power influencing policy. So I think there I just have to hand it to Banny. I mean, I think your presentation is perfect in terms of really then, once we say we're going to have these goals, we're going to redesign the instruments, how do you make sure that you do it in a non-simplistic way so you don't just go from one ideology to another? Right? I mean, that's the risk, and that's why I do put a bit of a thorn in the side to the European Commission. Be careful that this notion of missions isn't just another trendy concept which has no impact, and even worse, we do what we were already doing before, just with a different name, right? That's the biggest danger. But I do fundamentally think that economics has to be reinvented, not just reduced in power.
So in preparing for this and going through some newspaper clips and stuff, you've sometimes been accused of just, driving a lefty agenda. What's your comment?
Leftish.
Leftish agenda. What's your comment to that?
Well, that was a New York Times profile, which was very funny, because then I heard this very funny Japanese comedian who said, why do all these people invite you to a party at 7-ish or something? And she said she went back to Japan, and her mother slapped her when she said, I'll show up. And she didn't know how to say 7-ish, so she said between 7 and 7:15. She's like, no, you won't. You'll be here at 7 o'clock. And she said, that's why the Brits are called Brit-ish. Anyway, so the left-ish was quite a funny title. It was basically saying, hey, this is someone who's, bringing these concepts to the fore, and people are listening on both the right and the left. So my recent experience in the US was working just as closely with Elizabeth Warren AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, as with people like Marco Rubio, who was, is in the Republican Party. And I think if we do this mission stuff right, if we do it to really give concrete tangibility to this quest for purpose in the business roundtable, so in the private sector, this is absolutely a win-win.
Yeah.
But you know what? That sounds good, win-win. But in the meantime, some profits might have to go down. Not because we're against profits. As I said, there is profits made to go to the moon. But the way that some profits are too high right now is precisely because we don't admit this collective division of innovative labor. In the pharmaceutical industry, $40 billion a year is put in by the US taxpayer, and then the prices are set through value-based pricing that is simply a formula from the private sector, which then doesn't reward the public mission-oriented investment. And then welfare states like your own come in to get those prices down. But the question, if we bring purpose and mission to the core, is what should those prices be in the first place to reflect that public contribution? So this is why I think the pre-distribution wealth co-creation narrative for progressives, even to win elections, should be not just about wealth redistribution, as important as that is, but I hate to say it's a boring narrative. As important as it is, it's a bit more boring than, hey, we're going to create this stuff together in new ways, so let's make sure that we're socializing also the rewards because we did it together.
So I'll take that also as a last comment to our representatives from the government here, unless you want to add something else of a more provocative aspect.
I just want to go back to my earlier point. I think, because I don't hear it, and maybe it's because I'm not listening because all I'm doing is talking all the time, but I don't hear Sweden, Denmark, or Finland when, for example, Finland recently had the presidency of the European Council. I never heard the word stakeholder capitalism. So you have the opportunity, now that everyone's talking about it, again, just look at the Davos transcripts. It was in almost every session to be like, all right, not that you guys are perfect with it, but you have workers on the boards of your companies. Ericsson is fundamentally different from Cisco. We've had $4 trillion being used for share buybacks by companies like Cisco and Pfizer and others just in the last 10 years. That's a lack of reinvestment back into all these things that we're talking about. So Huawei, by the way, is a cooperative. I always tell them, remind people you're like John Lewis and they might like you more. But so you've experimented with different ways to govern corporations, and you've learned there's good and bad in that. Bring that to the table when you talk about the climate emergency, when you talk about the missions, because that's about doing capitalism differently. And I just think you should be proud to have at least gone through that. I know there's debates internally of what, if that's good, if that's bad, but debates is what makes anything useful and contested. And I just don't hear it. And I don't think it's because you're ashamed of it, because of course we hear about the welfare state, but the governance models both inside the state and the private sector have to be rethought, and the relationships, and you are a place that have had that for a very long time. So bring it to the fore along with your other urgencies.
This is wonderful. This is why we need this outside-in perspective. Thank you so much, Mariana.
Thank you.
So we're moving on in our program, and I just wanted to say that for those, many of you are already familiar with this, but during the past year, Vinnova has been working on prototyping some of these missions-oriented innovation processes within mainly two areas: healthy, sustainable food and healthy, sustainable mobility. We've engaged over 400 organizations. Some of you here today have been involved in these workshops from all different types of levels and sectors. And then we've also been seeing how can we integrate this into the key programs that we already run, like for instance the strategic innovation program Viable Cities. This is a program that we fund together with the Energy Agency and Formas, and also seeing how this can be connected to the EU Mission Board, which leads me to introduce our next speaker. We are now going to see what's going on a European level, and for that I'm very happy to be able to introduce Allan Larsson. Allan is Vice Chair of the Commission's Mission Board on Climate Neutral and Smart Cities, as well as Chair of the Swedish initiative Viable Cities. Tell us, Allan, how will Europe go from theory to practice?
Yes, thank you. 2 missions in practice. This is a first draft. Support, promote and showcase 100 climate neutral cities by 2030 by and for citizens, and make them innovation hubs for all cities in the run to 2050. That is a bold message which our mission board has delivered to the EU Commission, and we are on firm ground thanks to Professor Mazzucato's excellent report. Thank you for that. We are 15 members of the board. We were appointed during the summer. We started our work in September. Most of us had never met before. We worked hard. We delivered our report according to time plan before the end of the year. Now we'll use the first half of this year to present it for mayors, for ministers and policymakers like you all over Europe, and to get feedback and to help the Commission to further develop our proposal. The first question, no, this is too much. Did you see that one? Yes, that was the first. I should see it there. So this is the first question you met. Is it realistic to get 100 European cities to achieve in 10 years' time what the rest of Europe will have to do in 30 years? That's the question. We believe it is. It is necessary due to the current climate emergency. It's feasible because technology and innovation solutions are available, or more options will become available. It's feasible as prices and market conditions are moving in directions that favor climate-friendly investments. And finally, it's also feasible thanks to the European Green, which will further strengthen these trends. Next question. How can Europe and member states support cities to make a system transition climate sustainability? We are launching a couple of new ideas. One is a climate city contract, a climate city contract. The other is a new way of financial support. We call it the whole financial value chain. And let me explain what we mean. Climate city contract is a negotiated contract between the mayor of a city and an EU commissioner. It will include commitments from the mayor to make his or her city climate neutral by 2030 and coordinate all stakeholders within the city towards a common climate goal: business, NGOs, political parties, academia. It will include commitments from the Commission to support the mayor, the city, with innovation and funding. It will also include a one-stop shop for multi-level negotiations to simplify the whole process. We think about the negotiations as a co-creative process, which will serve as a formative policy development process in cities and as well in the European Commission. The strongest support we can give mayors and their cities is to offer a quite new holistic financial system instead of the present fragmented system. The idea is that the climate city contract should open windows to all funding mechanisms, both on EU level and national level. Horizon Europe, the European Investment Bank, the European Structural Investment Funds, the new Just Transition Fund, and other instruments. It should also include national funding, for example from Vinnova, Energimyndigheten, Formas, and Kommuninvest. Mission-oriented banks and funding facilities. That is the basic idea. Next question. How to turn barriers into drivers? We have identified city governance, among others, and including city planning, as a big barrier and a possible big driver. Cities are organized in silos to run schools, old age care, public transportation, streets and parks. It's fine, but you can't put climate change in a silo. That does not work. You will not get solutions. Cities must develop a holistic approach, what we call a climate city governance. As new buildings or new city districts only represent 1% of the built city. 1%, that is what we produce in 1 year of a city. Cities must focus on the 99% as well to change these areas, these districts, from fossil to renewable energy in our buildings and in our transport in cars. Who is responsible for that in your city? Making city drivers of innovation, that is another way of doing it. Too many examples of cities are repeating the old things, not thinking about the next opportunities. There's a lot of new technologies available, and I see few signs of that being used. Cities have well-developed digital strategies. All cities will need to develop digital support to climate governance, and there are also very many new means for that. Finally, citizens can be powerful drivers for climate action, and that is why the subtitle of our report is By and for Citizens. Our main message is that climate emergency must be tackled in cities and by citizens. Remember that cities represent 4% of the area of the Earth, of a firm area, not sea. 4%. 72% of emissions are coming from these 4%. That is, you can't address climate change without addressing cities. That's the key. And citizens are the key to change cities. So that is why we talk about by and for citizens. Citizens have a huge impact on the environment in their many different capacities, not only as a citizen that can take part in election every 4th year, but as consumers, producers, innovators, and owners of buildings, for example, housing associations. How many of you are members of a housing association, a bostadsrättsförening? Many of you. How many of you have been to an annual meeting and discussed a climate action program for your housing association? Do you know that you are by law required to have a sustainability report in your annual report? I haven't seen any such report, and I'm working with housing associations, so I hope that you have done that already. If you haven't, you have an annual meeting for spring, and you can do it then. Therefore, we suggest that climate city contracts should give citizens and civil society an active role, new platforms and new resources to act. And there's a huge potential by involving citizens in climate action. So, what do we mean by cities? Is it a city? Is it a city district or an urban area? For the moment, the answer is yes. In this report we speak of a city with 3 different geographical scopes: a city district, a city, or an urban area. The plurality has been chosen to invite an open process in the shaping and implementation of the commissions or the mission in each city. Thus the question, who can apply, will be further discussed. Hopefully our open invitation will become commission policy. So, what is now the next step? The mission board will continue during this year. Our proposal will hopefully be included in the EU Commission's next work program. If everything goes according to plan, there will be calls in 2021 and cities can start apply. My last picture and last question, how can Swedish cities prepare themselves to become European leaders in climate transition? You can do it by joining viable cities, We are a forerunner to the EU Mission Board. It's funded by Vinnova, Energimyndigheten, and Formas. When Olga Kordas, who is our program director, visited Brussels a year ago, and we were learning about what the Commission were thinking about Horizon Europe and things like that, and we presented our work in our Viable Cities Board. They told us, you should not come to us to ask what we are thinking. We would like to go to you to see what you're doing. So that's an example of that we are a forerunner in this. And there are 9 Swedish cities, local authorities, and their partners that are already on board in Viable Cities Climate Neutral 2030 program. They are Stockholm, Gothenburg, Malmö, Lund, Växjö, Uppsala, Umeå, Järfälla, Enköping. And tomorrow we have a board meeting in Viable Cities. We'll discuss how can we include climate city contracts and the funding mechanism in our way of working, and we hope that we'll have full support from the government for this. This will be a challenge for you from our meeting. So the door is open for more Swedish citizens to join. My colleagues, Olga Kordas and Åsa Minos, are here, and you can talk to them about that. So you are most welcome. If you are not already on board, welcome to join us. Thanks for your attention.
Great. Thank you very much. So when we, thank you, Allan. When we chatted a little bit earlier, I asked you whether you were optimistic or not, and you said you were optimistic. But then I was thinking, what is it that actually makes you optimistic? I mean, that's a little bit more interesting. What are things happening that really gives you reason to be optimistic? Just briefly.
Yeah, there are so many things going in the right direction. I think what you told us about stakeholder discussion, I've been writing about this, and I think this is an extremely important thing that is happening, and very few people are aware of that. So that's one thing. Business community have started to understand things must happen. And then we can see technology. There's a lot of that. I mean, I think that 90% of our problems with climate can be solved by existing technologies. But we have to have innovation in the public administration and the link between business and public. I can see that we can make, in my city district, Hammarby Sjöstad, we have now housing associations that are climate neutral. We don't need to have any new technology. We can do it with existing one, but the new one will make it even better. And by the way, it's extremely important. Can I take one simple example?
Very briefly, yes.
Our best example, Sjöstad, a housing association with 160 flats. They had an energy bill on 2.2 million Swedish crowns. That's now down to 340,000 crowns. So they have done it, make it climate neutral, and they have saved a lot of money. So this is a good thing.
Excellent. So we're looking forward to you writing up that as a case study for many people to learn from. Thank you very much. So I started this morning by saying how happy we were that we had such a broad representation from government. And now I'm extremely happy to be able to introduce you yet another person from our government. Please join me in welcoming Anders Ygeman, Minister for Energy and Digital Development from the Ministry of Infrastructure. So what are your main takeaways from today? Did you get any new inspiration?
I mean, maybe we should speak a little bit more about the stakeholder capitalism or the stakeholder society that we actually are building or thriving in Sweden. I mean, 3 examples. Northvolt, the biggest battery manufacturing factory in Europe, is being built in north of Sweden, because we could join forces between the government agencies like Vinnova and the private sector. You can take hybrid. In just a few years, the first fossil-free steel production in the world is being produced in Oxelösund in Sweden. Same thing there, with money from the government, with money from the private sector. We have the highest number of sold electric vehicles in the whole of European Union. Same there. We have an infrastructure provided by the government. We have subsidies from the government. We have a thriving market for electric cars. So, I mean, there's a lot of success stories in Sweden that we could label as stakeholder capitalism or democratic socialism, or whatever label you like to put on it, if you want to be leftish.
Please.
Okay. 150 years ago, Sweden was one of Europe's poorest countries. The difference was enormous between the few who owned the land and wealth and the many who worked in agriculture and factories. A quarter of the population was forced to leave Sweden to seek a better future in other countries. Many of them went to the US. In order to improve their living condition, people began to organize. They formed trade unions, associations, and political parties. But people also began to build a modern society. Everyone's right to school and education was introduced, and poor houses were abolished. Infrastructure, railways, electricity networks were built. Sweden was the first country in the world where all households were electrified. It was a historic change of society, which today forms the basis of the modern Swedish welfare state. Now we stand on the brink of a new transformation, the sustainable society. So what are the preconditions for us to take the lead? We have promoted policies to encourage sustainable transition since the 1990s. The results are clear. The share of renewables in transport are among the highest in Europe. Emissions per GDP has fallen sharply. In 2016, emissions intensity was 58% lower than in 1990. We could say that Sweden, the whole of Sweden, sets the same example as the housing association of Allan Larsson. We have managed to do the green shift, and we have managed to do it in an economical way. That the economy is thriving, and the emissions are getting lower. And I think that's the example we must set for especially the countries in Eastern Europe who now ask themselves, could we do this green transition? Will it threaten the welfare and the jobs of our industry? And our main mission is to say, no. The only way you can develop welfare, the only way you can develop the welfare of your countries is by doing this transition. It's the way of you going to be the winner. And we could help you doing that. We export more green electricity from Sweden than ever. Last year we exported 3/4 of the whole energy consumption of Denmark. By 2030, greenhouse gas emissions in the transport sector is to be 70% lower than in 2010. By 2040, 100% of the electricity production is to be renewable. By 2045, Sweden is to have no net emission of greenhouse gases. Thereafter, our net emissions will be negative. At the same time, great challenges remain. I believe that digitalization and the next generation of electrification are crucial to tackle climate change. In fact, we have yet only scraped the surface of the possibilities. Take the transport sector. March 2019 was the first month where more electrified cars were sold than hybrids. The forecasts tell us that the number of rechargeable cars will continue to increase. As I mentioned before, the biggest battery factory in Europe is built in Sweden. In the future, electrified and automated self-driving vehicles can replace many of today's fossil transports. Through fewer and more environmentally friendly transports, which we can share. It's a development that is going faster than we think. We will see the same development in those parts of the industry that have not yet been electrified. Take steel production, as I mentioned before the speech. As it is today, one of our absolute greatest sources of carbon dioxide emissions. By converting electricity into hydrogen, the production of steel can be free of carbon emissions. In just a few years, 2026, the production of carbon-free steel starts in Oxelösund in commercial scale. Take digitalization of our electricity networks. which enable us to electrify networks in a wholly new and smarter way, allowing individuals and companies to take responsibility for their own energy use. Digitalization and the next generation of electrification can contribute to solving some of the biggest challenges of our time, to combat climate change and create a better society, because that's what it's all about. Creating benefits that benefits everyone, not just a few, just like Sweden did 150 years ago. Perhaps the opportunities are now greater than any previous technology change. The commitment to realize them is great, from business, academia, and the public sectors and our cities. And I'm convinced of one thing. To meet major challenges, we must all work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's have a quick look at the cloud. We had made one of these word clouds earlier, just to try to capture which are the 3 activities or factors that are most important.
Cooperation seems to be there.
There you go. Yeah, and you know, love, collaboration. I think they're still ahead. Any?
Political action is quite big there as well.
Yeah. So anyway, with this, let's thank you again. Thank you. So we've had plenty of food for thought this morning. We're even running a little bit late. I hope that you feel that it's time well spent. There's now lunch for everyone. And after lunch, the people who have registered for the workshops are very welcome to gather in the, I think it's in the museum restaurant. I will please ask you to be there early, maybe 5 minutes early, because the workshop will really start at 1 o'clock sharp, and there are assigned seats, so I hope that works well. I also wanted to say, so I think you can also see you have a purple or a pinkish-ish label at the bottom of your label. You'll see a color which shows that you've been pre-registered. Also, I just wanted to say that keep your eyes open. There's a podcast coming soon to a pod near you. In the pod, the Vinnova Innovation Pod, Innovation by Vinnova, featuring among many people, again, Mariana Mazzucato. So keep your eyes open for that. It's coming up. And just to finish, I'd like to thank our host, Arctes. Thank you very much for letting us be in this wonderful venue. And last, thank you all for coming today. Thank you.